Hello, I'm Callum of the Embrace Historia channel, and today I will be making the argument that the Battle of Hastings is the world's most important battle. So a pretty big argument to make. Now I'm standing behind a building that also stood when the Battle of Hastings took place. This is Odda's Chapel, built in 1056, so 10 years before the conquest of England by the Normans. This area is quite local to me, and I felt this was a good place to start the video. So it's pretty amazing to stand behind a building that while the Normans and Anglo-Saxons were fighting it out, life was still going on for the people in this area. So how this video is going to go, I'll explain a short background as to why the Battle of Hastings happened, and then all the short-term effects and then the long-term effects, such as the linguistics, politics, landscape, etc. changes down the centuries and how they relate to the Battle of Hastings. Alongside that, as we move forward down the centuries after the battle, I'll compare some other battles with Hastings, both before 1066 and after, which I'll rank alongside Hastings as its impact on world history in one chapter. Now, I'll admit this topic has got its fallacies, one being incredibly Eurocentric, but this video is more for entertainment and just something that's been on my mind for a while that I wanted to express in a creative way. Now where I am currently, the end results of one major battle that happened 50 years before Hastings is just a short walk away from Odda's Chapel. This is the Priory Church of St. Mary, near the site where England was partitioned by two rivals for the throne of England back in 1016, 50 years before Hastings. This battle that determined England's future was called the Battle of Asandun. Somewhere around here, Canute and Edmund Ironside met and made peace and an agreement, from the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. Then after this fight, King Canute turned inland with his raiding army to Gloucestershire, where he learned that Edmund the king was. Then Ealdorman Edric and the councillors who were gathered there advised that the kings form a pact between them, and the kings came together at Ola's Island near Deerhurst, and became partners and pledge brothers, and affirmed both with pledge and also with oaths, and set the payment for the raiding army. And afterwards they parted, and then King Edmund succeeded to Wessex and Canute to the north part. So this is a really important battle that if things had played out differently with Canute's successors succeeding as the Normans had, the Battle of Hastings might have never happened. So that's one battle that is on a near level playing field to Hastings, because, to reiterate, I believe that the Battle of Hastings is the singular most important battle in world history because of everything that followed after it. I cannot recall another battle having such an impact on the same level as Hastings. Now for those that aren't British, let me explain with a short background and the reasons why the Battle of Hastings happened. The last king of the Wessex dynasty, King Edward, later known as Edward the Confessor, died in early 1066 without a clear successor. He had no children, and all of his immediate nephews were dead. There was his great-nephew Edgar, but he wasn't old enough and didn't have many powerful nobles backing him. Now, when Edward inherited the throne, his situation was quite different from his predecessors. Edward had spent quite a number of his years in exile in Normandy, and when he returned to England, he didn't have the kind of power base a normal king would have if they were raised in England. Instead, Edward had to rely either willingly or unwillingly on Earl Godwin, the most powerful man in England at the time. And Godwin may have ordered the murder of Edward's older brother, Alfred, back in 1036. So a contentious relationship at best, possibly not helped with Edward having to marry Godwin's daughter. But that's another tale. Moving on, Godwin had plenty of sons, who held powerful positions within England. One of them became possibly Edward's right hand, or worked into the same position as his father had. This was Harold Godwin's son. By 1065, Edward was old, and towards the end of the year he was dying. Now, depending on whose accounts you read, as many accounts of the time and afterwards make various cases on what happened next. Either Edward on his deathbed tells Harold to look after the kingdom for him as king, or to hold the kingdom for someone else. For Anglo-Saxon England, the Witan, which was usually a gathering of nobility, usually had a say in who becomes king. John of Worcester called Harold the vice-king. The problem was the situation for succession was messed up by the Viking conquest of England in 1016. Then we get to the others who claimed the throne of England: Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, and William of Normandy, both capable military leaders and powerful men. So what we have now is a threesome tie, and not in the fun way, for the throne of England. Harold Hardrada believed he was owed the throne of England via a prior agreement, and was being aided by Harold's exiled brother, Tostig Godwinson. This led to the epic Battle of Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September 1066. And like so many large important battles, there's many different accounts of the battle, so I'm going with one of my favourite chroniclers, John of Worcester, from his account in 1115. Harold, King of England, having reached York with many thousand well-armed troops, encountered the Norwegians at a place called Stamford Bridge, and put to the sword King Harold and Earl Tostig with the greatest part of their army, and, although the battle was severely contested, gained a complete victory. And then we get to William, whose claim is based off that King Edward had at some point promised the throne to him, and that Harold had sworn to aid him. All of this is featured in the beautiful and pro-Norman Bayeux Tapestry. From John of Worcester's account, while these events were passing, and when the king might have supposed that all his enemies were quelled, he received intelligence of the arrival of William, Earl of Normandy, with an innumerable host of horsemen, slingers, archers, and foot soldiers, having taken into his pay auxiliary forces of great bravery from all parts of France, and that he had moored his fleet at a place called Pevensey. Thereupon, the king led his army towards London by forced marches, and although he was very sensible that some of the bravest men in England had fallen in 2 recent battles, and that one half of his troops were not yet assembled, he did not hesitate to meet the enemy in Sussex without loss of time. And we know what happens next: the Battle of Hastings, which, let's quote from the Worcester version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. Then Earl William came from Normandy into Pevensey on the eve of the feast of St. Michael. Then this became known to King Harold, and he gathered a great raiding army and came against him at the Grey Apple Tree. And when William came upon him by surprise before his people were marshalled, nevertheless the king fought very hard against him with those men who wanted to support him, and there was a great slaughter on either side. There was killed King Harold and his brothers, and many good men, and the Normans had possession of the place of slaughter, just as God granted them because of the people's sins. So you should have an idea of how the Battle of Hastings played out with some background information. Now on to the short-term impacts of Hastings, which we will cover the period of William's reign from 1066 to 1087. The battle itself was a grave sin. Remember, this was Christians killing fellow Christians. The Pope would lament such slaughter and death, so penance must be paid. One example is this: whoever does not know the number of those he struck or killed shall, at the discretion of his bishops, do penance for 1 day a week for the rest of his life, or, if he is able, make amends either by building a church or by giving perpetual alms to one. King William ordered the building of Battle Abbey to atone for his sins, either near the battle site or on it, something historians have argued for and against for years now, as all the accounts of Hastings are not eyewitness ones from any of the chroniclers, such as the Anglo-Saxon chronicles or William of Poitiers, Orderic Vitalis, etc. So whether the battle took place on Battle Abbey or on Calbeck Hill, there's a cool abbey nearby that may have been built by the conqueror to atone for his sins. If only he learned his lessons at Hastings not to butcher everyone. Well, he certainly didn't, as one of the worst short-term impacts of Hastings is the harrying of the North. The harrying of the North was William's response to uprisings in the north of England. The event was devastating that many chroniclers gave long and horrible descriptions of the harrying. One example, giving way to his resentment, and spent the whole winter in laying waste the country, slaughtering the inhabitants, and inflicting every sort of evil without cessation. Meanwhile, he dispatched messengers to the Danish Carl and promised to pay him secretly a large sum of money and grant permission for his army to forage freely along the sea coast, on condition that he would depart without fighting when the winter was over. And he, in his extreme greediness for lucre and to his utter disgrace, consented to the proposal. In the consequence of the ravages of the Normans, first in Northumbria the preceding year, and again in the present and following year, throughout nearly the whole of England, so severe a famine prevailed in most parts of the kingdom, but chiefly in Northumbria and the adjacent provinces, that men were driven to feed on the flesh of horses, dogs, cats, and even of human beings. So the harrying of the north was greatly damaging to the north of England and took many years for the area and for the people to recover. We know this thanks to another consequence from Hastings, which is both a short-term impact and a long-term one, the Domesday Book, also known as the Great Survey. This survey was compiled during the last few years of King William's reign, or in the early years of his successor, William II or William Rufus, from Open Domesday. Domesday Book was a detailed survey of land holdings and resources in England in AD 1086. It is one of the most important historical records ever made. So the Domesday Book shows us how destructive the harrying of the North was. For a more in-depth view, be sure to check out the website Open Domesday. But the survey is an absolutely brilliant resource for researching English history along with the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. So with these resources, we can learn just how important Hastings was for England, good or bad. Mostly bad for the people of the time. Slavery is also affected with the Norman conquest. On some locations listed in Domesday, slaves are listed under households. William of Malmesbury gives us a rather horrible description of the slave trade from before the Norman conquest. So be warned, it's not something everyone wants to hear. They would purchase people from all over England and sell them off to Ireland in the hope of profit, and put up for sale maidservants after toying with them in bed and making them pregnant. You would have groaned to see the files of the wretches of people roped together, young people of both sexes, whose youth and beauty would have aroused the pity of barbarians, being put up for sale every day. William may have learnt of this tale either through word of mouth or maybe some records, but no doubt such trades of people occurred during Anglo-Saxon England. The population of slaves was large, anywhere from 10 to 20% of the population before 1066. However, the institution of slavery did not end in England with the coming of the Normans, but their growing power over the country did provide the means necessary to bring the trading in slaves to an eventual halt. Now on to perhaps the most famous impact as a result of the Battle of Hastings that is the most well known: castles. One of the first actions Duke William took when he and his army landed was to build a castle at Hastings market town. After the conquest, King William ordered the building of castles all over England, and when on campaign in the north of England, William ordered the construction of many castles on his route towards Yorkshire. The most famous castle out of all of them is probably the White Castle, also known as the Tower of London. The first time a castle is mentioned in England is actually back in 1051 from the Peterborough version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which states that the foreigners had then built a castle in Herefordshire, these foreigners being King Edward's supporters from his time in Normandy. Nothing remains of these castles as they were built with wood, yet so many castles that were built within the reign of King William the Conqueror still remain. As I mentioned, the Tower of London, but also Clifford's Tower in York, Chepstow Castle in Wales, Lincoln Castle, Dover Castle, etc. There is so many. One impact that is again both a short and long impact, which I'll expand on in the next chapter, is language. The King of England in 1066 was a man who spoke Old English, and by the end of the year, the new king spoke Norman French. And by the end of William's reign, so did the ruling class in England. One other interesting effect from Hastings is the dwindling influence of Norse/Scandinavian on England. The Battle of Stamford Bridge is considered the end of that influence on England with Hardrada's death, but William faced two invasions from Denmark, one in 1067/1070 and the other in 1075. But thanks to William's actions of both sword and money, these invasions came to nothing. Then we have the Forest Laws, in which William, who by the way loved hunting so much that this law is a direct influence from him. I've covered the hobby of hunting in my English Medieval King series on their hobbies. The Forest Laws were a set of laws in 1079 where the king could designate an area of land to become a royal forest. It could be any area of land in England, not just as the name implies, forbidding the hunting of game within the forest, or even cutting wood, or the collecting of fallen timber, or anything growing within the forest that might be of use. The Crown made a lot of money from these forest laws, but they also played a larger impact down the centuries, which I'll go over in the next chapter. And the final part for the short-term impact of Hastings, we have the style of warfare and the battle itself. The warfare after Hastings was changed completely, as the Normans would conquer England. Their style of fighting and tactics would be implemented and used again and again, mainly their use of the power of the Norman knights and their war horses. This was a major difference to the horses that the Anglo-Saxons used, as they used their horses for transport only, dismounting to fight normally in a shield wall. This was the tactic that Harold used in the battle, on high ground and a tightly packed wall of shields, whereas the Normans used horsemen, slingers, archers and foot soldiers, plus even the odd crossbowmen to try and break apart the shield wall. The battle also lasted ages. This was another standout moment, as most battles in the Middle Ages lasted a few hours, whereas Hastings lasted until dusk and was brutal. There wouldn't be another bloody battle like it in England until 1265 at the Battle of Evesham. Now, one of the best visual aids to show Hastings is of course the Bayeux Tapestry, which I'll talk about in the next chapter, the long-term impacts of Hastings. The Battle of Hastings is such a big bang moment for history. Many things happened that spawned directly from the battle, and now I'm going to talk about the long-term impacts of Hastings, starting with the Bayeux Tapestry, which is a fantastic historical resource, which I believe has amplified the Battle of Hastings' legacy. This wonderful, long and detailed showing of at least the Norman perspective of the battle and the conquest of England. It's great because it not only shows a physical description of England, but also gives us a glimpse of certain aspects of the time period. For example, one thing I love that the tapestry depicts is Edward the Confessor's Westminster Abbey. Plus the tapestry shows us how people were dressed, the style of their hair and facial hair, how food and material were transported, and how people dined. It's a truly great resource we have, and the long-term impact is that millions of people have seen this tapestry and learnt about the history and heritage of it all. Now back to language. The aftermath of Hastings would see that the English language would be changed forever, and develop in a way that continues to this day, with its mixture of Scandinavian and Old French, and with it diverging into many different dialects over the centuries. Nowadays we have a variety of English. I'm speaking to you in British English, but there's many others: Aussie English, American English, Indian English, etc. All of these variations can trace their origins directly from the Battle of Hastings. Now back to castles. As I said, many castles that William founded still stand today, and with the many castles plus the burhs, aka fortified towns and cities, which certainly made invading and controlling parts of England much harder to do. We know this because of a certain civil war taking place 73 years after the Battle of Hastings, by which time a great many castles had been built. This was a civil war between two of William's grandchildren. I'm of course talking about the Anarchy, a civil war between Empress Matilda and King Stephen, something I've talked about many times before and even have a video series on, so I'm not going to dwell on this for too long. Essentially, this period was known for its many sieges on the castles. One particular castle was so important that it meant that Empress Matilda kept her holdings in England for as long as she did. This was Wallingford Castle. It was considered one of the best castles of this period, as it proved this by the garrison holding out for so long, as any direct assault on the walls were deemed pointless to attempt. This pattern would continue during the many civil wars in England, from the First Barons' War to even further beyond, into the age of gunpowder and cannon, as many castles played a vital role during this conflict, known as the British Civil Wars. Even today, loads of people visit castles, because 1, they're cool to explore, and 2, because they provide that connection to the past, where people can experience a unique kind of heritage. Nationalism is one long-term effect from Hastings, both in England and France, as the two nations' history was to be intertwined with each other over the course of the next centuries, which culminated with the 116 Years' War. Quite a number of national figures appeared during this war. For England, Edward III adopting St. George as the patron saint of England, with St. George's Day celebrated in England every year, and then for the French, Joan of Arc becoming a leading figure in the later part of the war and eventually becoming a symbol of French nationalism. But both English and French nationalism can be traced before Hastings. One of the earliest accounts we can trace English nationalism to is Bede's account from the 8th century, in which he writes about the history of the people, quote, "I, Bede, have composed this ecclesiastical history of Britain and of the English people, using what information I could acquire from ancient documents, from the tradition of my elders, and from my very own knowledge." Further evidence can be read from the extracts of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles and later chroniclers such as William of Malmesbury. But after Hastings, we have direct influence from the Normans on how English nationalism would develop, as the new Norman nobility would rapidly become English, especially in the North and Midlands. To offer an example of this, we can look at the reign of the Angevin kings, who ruled England, but also extensive lands in France, from Henry II to Richard the Lionheart, and finally to King Lackland John. Because these three kings, especially Richard, were spending their time constantly in France dealing with affairs there, as England was relatively secure, whereas in France, the kings there had to deal with so much political strategies, like one giant game of chess between them and the French king, alongside each other's allies. There began a growing resentment in England that this quote from the Bishop of Lincoln in 1196 explains. "I am well aware that the Church of Lincoln is bound to do the king military service, but only in this country. Outside the boundaries of England, no such thing is owed." So already the Normans had integrated into England, and they were pivotal in the development of English nationalism. All of this from the Battle of Hastings. Nowadays, English nationalism is a bit different from the previous eras, so for me, English nationalism is talking about the weather, in which many English people will comment that the weather is too cold and wet, or too wet and miserable, but then complain it's too hot and humid. Other aspects of modern Englishness is being a member of both English heritage and the National Trust, thus getting access to many castles, manors, estates, gardens, etc. And speaking of gardens, one quintessential trait of Englishness is going to a garden centre at the weekend. One bad aspect of English nationalism is being drunk and annoying in other countries. I'll end this chapter on English nationalism with my favourite quote from a French king on the English. "I have chased the English out of France more easily than my father did, for he had to drive them out with armies, while I have seen them off with venison and good French wine." The reason that the Battle of Hastings is more relevant for the world stage as perhaps the most important battle in world history is simply because of the British Empire. Without the Battle of Hastings, there might not have been a British Empire. I know that's a huge stretch, as I've mainly been focusing on events that have occurred during the Middle Ages after Hastings, but I think it's a fair statement to make, and due to the British Empire, English is one of the most spoken languages in the world, good or bad, depending on your interpretation. If Hastings hadn't happened, or if Harold had won, would there have been a British Empire? But that's alternative history, which I have no interest in. There's far too many variables to make an attempt. With everything I've mentioned, hopefully you've understood my point of view and my arguments as to why Hastings is just so important for world history and heritage, as it's one of the key moments in English history that draws people in to learn about the history and why it's such a massive chapter. This can be seen with the Battle of Hastings reenactments at Battle Abbey over the years, plus the huge amount of documentaries, merchandise, museums, books, and so much more that celebrate the Battle of Hastings. Comparable battles. In this chapter, I'm going to talk about other battles that are near or on the same level as importance for world history and comparing their impacts on history alongside Hastings. Starting with what I think is the most obvious battle to compare, the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, the Greek states versus the Persian Empire. I find this battle significant as it's the opposite of Hastings, in that the defender won against the invader. It would be impossible to try and predict what might have happened had the Greeks lost and the Persian Empire conquered Greece. Herodotus gives us the fullest account of the battle. Here's a short quote. "The two armies fought together on the plain of Marathon for a length of time, and in the mid-battle, where the Persians themselves and the Sacer had their place, the barbarians were victorious and broke and pursued the Greeks into the inner country. But on the two wings, the Athenians and the Plataeans defeated the enemy. Having so done, they suffered the routed barbarians to fly at their ease, and joining the two wings into one, fell upon those who had broken their own centre, and fought and conquered them. These likewise fled, and now the Athenians hung upon the runaways and cut them down, chasing them all the way to the shore, on reaching which they laid hold of the ships and called aloud for fire." The Battle of Marathon has such a huge impact on world history on the same level as Hastings, but also the Greeks get a double whammy victory, as there's also the second invasion of Greece by the Persian Empire, with other huge victories for the Greeks at the Battle of Thermopylae and Salamis. The reasons I consider these battles on the same level of Hastings is due in part because of the many things that are associated with the ancient Greeks, such as classical art, politics, dramas, philosophy, etc. It's one of the many tales we're taught at a young age as a defining moment in history, as my first memory I can recall of ancient Greece is the tales of Odysseus. Moving on to the next battle, we have a similar battle that had the same results as Hastings, but in Iberia, and this battle came before Hastings, but differ in quite a number of ways. The Battle of Guadalete in 711 AD, which saw the defeat of the Visigothic kingdom and the later conquest of most of Iberia by the Umayyad Caliphate. This would then lead to the long Reconquista, where successor kingdoms of the Kingdom of Asturias would take control of Iberia, the Reconquista lasting until 1492. This battle is similar to Hastings in a lot of ways. For example, both take place in the Middle Ages, both end similar, where a near whole region is conquered, but the Reconquista is a different outcome, as opposed to England being conquered and the conquerors assimilating into England's national story, as the kingdoms in Iberia would take a different path in how the conquest played a part in their stories. One other similar match is that the armies fought differently to each other. Harold's shield wall and William's more diverse army, and for Guadalete, Roderick's heavier troops versus Tarek's lighter troops and their hit-and-run tactics. This battle then leads us to our next one, which is the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, in which the Frankish kingdom under Charles Martel checked the advance of the Umayyad Caliphate into Europe. This battle had far-reaching consequences, the further growth of the Frankish kingdom into one of the largest empires in the Middle Ages under Charles's grandson, Charlemagne, which the Carolingian Empire is also a product of this battle. Some historians rate this battle highly, and others summarize it as more of a skirmish. However, one chronicler, titled The Chronicle of St. Denis, offered a very inflated account of the battle. In one line it states that he wrought a great slaughter upon the enemies of Christian faith, so that, as history bears witness, he slew in that battle 300,000 men. Quite a number of chroniclers like to exaggerate numbers when it comes to important battles, but now I've covered a few battles which I believe are on par with Hastings. I'm now going to quickly go over some more battles, but in shorter context. Starting with the Battle of Elladoun in 825, this battle took place in what would become England, around the area of Swindon, between the two most powerful early English kingdoms, Mercia and Wessex. For quite a number of years, Mercia had dominated the other smaller kingdoms, and this battle changed the power structure until the formation of England under the Wessex kings. We don't have many details on this battle, but with Wessex victory over Mercia, and in which in 829, according to the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, King Egbert conquered the kingdom of Mercia, Wessex became the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The Battle of Edington in 878, in which the King of Wessex, Alfred the Great, who also later became King of the Anglo-Saxons, defeated a Viking army under Guthrum. Nearly all the early English kingdoms had been defeated, raided, and mostly conquered by the Vikings in 878. Alfred himself was nearly defeated by them at one point, but Alfred came back and rallied his men before defeating the Vikings at Edington, thus securing the future of Wessex and the later conquests by his son and daughter, with the Kingdom of England being formed by his grandson, Aethelstan, the first king of the English, which leads us to the next battle, titled Bunumbra, in which Aethelstan and the fate of the newly formed Kingdom of England hung in the balance, as Aethelstan's enemies had formed a coalition to defeat him. The two sides met and clashed in a shield wall versus shield wall. Eventually, Aethelstan's forces gained the victory and secured England's future. There's tons of other battles that we could make the argument are on the same level as Hastings, which I've not mentioned, like the fall of Constantinople, or Waterloo, or Castiglione, or Zama. There's so many which I'm sure there'll be arguments in the comment section of the video. But if you've enjoyed this video, you can support the channel via Patreon or become a YouTube channel member. Either sub gets you access to bonus videos, behind the scenes content, and updates. Plus, if you want some short form history content, I regularly post on Instagram. But as always, be sure to like, hype, share, and comment. I do enjoy reading the comments. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to deep dive into the comment section as it turns into a war. See you later.